Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This workshop is a 2-hour workshop hosted by Dr. Joseph Kursky from Esri. And we are organizing this on behalf of the GIS Community of Practice, the GIS COP at UMass. I'm going to drop a link into the chat. So this is hopefully the link to our new Google group. We just transitioned our listserv over to a Google group, so you should be able to join that. You might need to log in with your UMass account. This is a fun just community of fellow GIS users across UMass campus, kind of medium volume, might get like 10 messages a week or about that. And we share information about things like this workshop, job opportunities, anything like that. And we're going to be having a couple more Esri hosted workshops in the coming year, which we're excited about. And that is where we will share information about that. So if you're interested at all in joining, please do. So I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph Kursky, who is an education manager and geographer at Esri. He has quite a long list of accomplishments, which hopefully you've already read about. I won't list them all here. I will let him take over and help us understand how to tell our stories with ArcGIS Story Maps.
Well, many thanks, Dr. Becky. It's good to see you all, and greetings all. Welcome. I so appreciate the support for the workshop today. So thanks to everyone who was involved setting this up. And it's great to work with people like Becky that are in the library and are supporting geospatial technology throughout the campus. I know we've got some people from outside UMass, but I've been a big fan of hers for a long time now. It's ever since I've known her. And I also know Forrest Bolick and some other good people in your community. So thanks for having me. And I'd love to keep working with you in the future. I'm going to put up my contact information here right now so we can keep in touch going forward, because it is a journey, right, that we're all on. And so kind of along those lines, just a couple of big questions to keep in mind as we work with any sort of geotechnologies or any aspect of the growing platform that is geotechnologies. And that is, keep in mind the bigger goals, right? Sure, we want to learn about story maps and tools and things like that. But the bigger goals are that we want to improve education and society through applied spatial thinking and geotechnologies. So making the planet and its people more happy, more resilient, more sustainable, and so on. So that's really the higher and greater goal when we're using these tools. And I love the geospatial technology education community. They are very caring and they're very focused on helping and geo-mentoring and so on. So if you get stuck along the way, there are lots of good people in this community, and we are all coming right alongside you to help you along the way. I also believe that education is under, just like many other major societal institutions, major disruption. So again, I as much as I appreciated all of you a year ago, I even more appreciate you now that you're innovating in a time of major disruption. And not all the disruption is good. So, but you're reinventing your departments, your courses. You're trying to think creatively about how do we structure this going forward. And despite the articles 20 years ago that said, geotechnologies is not going to be a thing in 2020 or 2021, it is, because all of the issues and problems that we're dealing with in society have a spatial component, right? Whether it's racial and social inequities, whether it's climate or biodiversity loss or natural hazards, they all have a spatial component, and hence we can use geotechnologies to get a handle on and grapple with and solve these problems and reverse some of the trends that we're seeing over the past decades. So geotechnologies is going to continue. I like to think of it as what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? What's where, why is it there, and why should we care? And that last piece has an action component in it, right? It's so we're gaining newfound knowledge about these systems, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the anthrosphere, the biosphere, et cetera. But we're also gaining GIS knowledge. We're gaining communication knowledge, which is especially pertinent with story mapping. But we're also doing something about it when we can, right? We're saying we're gaining this knowledge and skill, but then it leads to action about litter or invasive species or whatever it is that we're studying. So geotechnologies will continue. It's not going to go away. It is going to remain increasingly relevant as we go forward. So here is my own contact information. As many of you know, I'm very passionate about all of this. I have over 5,000 videos on my Our Earth channel, so feel free to tap in. Warning, it's pretty geeky. It's all focused on geotechnologies and education. But I'm very active on LinkedIn and et cetera. So feel free to connect with me. Now, why should you listen to Joseph? Well, I'm not the end all be all authority on the topic today and other related topics, but I've got a long history of major sectors of society that I've been sort of blessed with being in. So 4 major sectors: federal agencies, NOAA, Census, USGS. I was at the USGS from the Cretaceous to the Holocene, okay, a long period of time. And I'm at Esri on the education team now, and think of us as your industry partner going forward. We are here not just from yesterday saying, hey, we need to be working with educators and with researchers and with campus facilities people. It started in 1992, actually, the education program here. We're very well supported by Jack Dangerman all the way through our team. We're all educators too. So many of us, myself included, teach. We love, like many of you, teaching and working with students and faculty. So I'm teaching this semester at the University of Minnesota and the University of Denver. And I've also been active in nonprofit organizations like the National Council for Geographic Education. So anyway, that's my background. I love working with this community. So let's keep it going and moving forward. So this particular workshop today, and hopefully you're seeing this teaching and learning with ArcGIS Story Maps. We're going to talk about why to use story maps, what they are, how they fit into the geospatial platform, and some hands-on about how to use them. And then a little bit about, okay, how do you go forward from this workshop? So that's our workshop objective. And I think many of you know this, but I promise people that I spread the word, and thanks for opening it up, Becky, to others, that this would be starting with, I really know nothing at all about story maps, and I've maybe seen a few, but I've not actually created one myself. So I promised people I would start with the very basics. They're simple web mapping applications. What does that mean? It means that they're built on this web GIS infrastructure. So you've got software as a service, you've got data as services running in the cloud, and you can create multimedia web maps that tell a story about something local, about something global, and just about everything in between, and just about every subject matter from architecture and agriculture to zoology, really, literally from A to Z. And another exciting thing to me and to many other people in the community is that story maps can be saved, shared, and embedded. We'll talk about that as well. And they can receive real-time data feeds and combined with surveys and other GIS elements. That is, I think, one of the most exciting things about modern story mapping, is that you can connect them with other tools in this platform. More about that in a bit. But just laying some of the foundations here, this ArcGIS system includes several things that maybe some of you are using. For example, you've got ArcGIS Online, the software as a service platform that you can build upon. More about that in a bit. There's also desktop ArcGIS Pro, but it's not desktop like the old days desktop where it was totally disconnected from anything else. Think of it sort of as like a Microsoft Office, right? You have an Office, but it's probably Office 365, which is actually running on a server, and you've got connectivity to other things. You can share documents in OneDrive, etc. So ArcGIS Pro, for example, is connected to this cloud-based infrastructure. Yes, you can run it offline, but it's got more power, and indeed some of the functions like geocoding and other tools actually run with cloud-based services to take advantage of that distributed architecture and processing speed. So it's much more powerful if you're running it in the cloud. We're connected to your cloud-based account, you're running it locally. But ArcGIS Enterprise, some people want to have their own server for various reasons, security and other things, that they basically are running something like ArcGIS Online, but in their own local infrastructure and on their own servers. Now, part of that ArcGIS Online platform is a variety of apps. And these apps, the way I think of it is they bring field tools and office tools to GIS people for sure, but also to others. And one of the goals of the team that I'm on is to enable and help and assist all of you in spreading the good word about geospatial technologies and their advantages to the non-geo-enviro-geography community. In other words, to business, to engineering, to data science, and to other disciplines. And I think that these apps help do that because people can understand, oh, story maps is not that complicated. I can do that, and I can use it in a variety of ways in instruction and research. So that's what these apps do. The family of apps is here. We're going to be focused on story maps today, but again, the connectivity of, for example, connecting story maps to some field survey that you set up, for example, in Survey 123, and you bring the data into a story map. I'll show an example of that. And I think that's really powerful. And there are certain themes. There are lots of apps, and I'm not listing them all on this particular frame, but we are, as you can see here, we're inside this office set, and we're going to be into story mapping right in here. Now, there is a bunch of field apps as well, but here's an example of, I hope this is instructive. So how does this compare or relate to ArcGIS Online? Okay, so here's an example. This is pretty geeky, but it's an example of a track that I took right after an AAG conference one year. I always wanted to bicycle across the George Washington Bridge into New Jersey from New York City. And I went up to this point here, which is in itself pretty geeky, but that's because that's at the intersection of a certain latitude and longitude line in the middle of a field. But as I was biking there, I had a GPS, an actual GPS receiver with me. It was too far, and I'm too out of shape to actually have my phone on collecting data the whole time. So I thought I'd play it safe and have an actual GPS receiver. So this is my bicycling route. I've got it inside ArcGIS Online. It came in as a GPX file, an XML GPS file, basically with a set of lat longs. So I've got that inside ArcGIS Online. Okay. Well, I also have that inside a story map. So in this particular story map, I put a couple of things on it. I put, hey, what's the median age of the neighborhoods that I was cycling through? So I went from sort of younger median age out into New Jersey, and I've got a little bit of older neighborhoods that I was, according to this data set. We always have to say according to this data set because we want to think about who created the data, why was it created, how often is it updated, and so on. So that's important for us to keep in mind, and more about that in a bit. But I've also got a profile tool, inside this story map. So this isn't the Rocky Mountains. This is but it's the New Jersey Palisades, and there were some fair amount of hills here. You can see the scales here on the X and the Y axis. But the point is, was a web map inside ArcGIS Online. But since I had it in ArcGIS Online, my track, I could then say, I want to make a story map out of this, and I want to add a few elements to it, the median age and the profile. Now, do they still make Lunchables? Remember those Lunchable things in the store? They were like these, you get 3 carrots and 5 crackers and 2 pieces of cheese and maybe some other things. But you can't modify them, right? They're prepackaged. They're like that. So the story map, as it's delivered to your user, your end user, by and large, we'll talk about some of the nuances, but by and large, they're going to be delivered as things that your end user cannot modify. So you're deciding, which is a key part of this, what story to tell and how to tell it. And so your end user is interacting with the elements that you create in your story map. So they're getting it as a package that they can't really modify, as opposed to that earlier map that I had up here inside ArcGIS Online. You could go to my web map for Joseph's bicycling route from New York City to New Jersey. You could go in there and you can change my original track, but then you could take that track and then you could add your own data to it and save it in ArcGIS Online into your own account, which is a really interesting thing as we go forward about, do you take that metadata of the original map that you're modifying and bring it forward to the next user that's going to interact with it? I hope so. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But the point is, you can actually not modify my original content, but you could take that content and then start adding to it and modifying it in certain ways, changing the projection, changing the symbology, et cetera, and then saving that into your own account. Whereas the story map, you really can't modify it unless I had some sort of data feed or had a modify button on there or something like that. Now, why teach and learn with story maps? Why should we care about this? Well, my philosophy, folks, is it's only use the tools if they add value to what you're doing, okay? So for example, I still use Prezi I still use Microsoft Sway. I still use PowerPoint to present the results of my investigation or research or so on and so on. But as you can see, this particular presentation that I'm giving you right now, this whole thing, if you look up in the upper left there on the URL, it's actually a story map, this whole thing, because I've got some interactive maps like I just showed, and I wanted to be able to have you interact with them when I share this URL or Becky shares the URL with you all, or all y'all, as I say in Texas. Ustedes, vous, tú, all you people, okay? All you good geo people. But the point is, this is really quite suitable to what I wanted to present, so I'm using a story map to present. But I'm all about using the most appropriate tool for the job, no matter what it is, GIS or non-GIS. So use story maps if they add value to what you're doing. And I think a couple of advantages here you can read for yourself. But again, it's part of the platform. So it's not just, now we all use one-off tools, right? I use something like EarthenView, for example. It's like 300 kilobytes in size. It does my one-touch photo editing quite nicely for me. And I've used it for many, many years. You probably have tools like that you use as well. They do one or two things and they do them well. And they're not really connected to anything else, but they have value to you. So you continue using them. Story maps are not the only ways to tell multimedia stories with mapping in. They're part of the ArcGIS platform. So they're in Esri land. They're not the only story maps tools out there, but I think they're valuable in large part because they are connected to this bigger set of tools and data sets at your fingertips. In other words, Joseph didn't create these in his garage type of thing, and they're not connected to anything else. And as you can see here, they're providing these skills as you use them, as your students use them, as your fellow faculty use them. So again, you're thinking about the bigger goals. You're not just using them to learn story maps. And they're very engaging tools, but there's a higher and bigger goal in using them. And I think these are part of the reasons. We could listen more, but there are, in my way of thinking about it, just to kind of keep things simple, three main ways that story maps are actually used in education. You can teach existing content with story maps. So if I go, for example, to the hot numbers story map, it's all about, as you probably would expect, climate change. And so this one is actually a fairly lengthy story map. We'll talk about what's the ideal length of these things. It really depends what you want to tell and how you want to break up the story map. This one, as you can see from the size of the scroll bar in the upper right, it's fairly long, but it has some compelling images in it. It's got some graphs. It's got some maps. And again, because this is tied to the ArcGIS platform, you've got the capability of using ArcGIS web maps, but also like interactive maps like this, right? But you can also get into the 3D scene viewer. Again, when it's appropriate, the 3D capabilities and visualization tools might be very good for you to use inside your story map. So this is an example of, I'm going to teach about climate in my physical geography class or in my climatology class or whatever it is, in my environmental science studies class. And I'm going to use this as maybe not the only, probably not the only tool that I'm going to use, but it's a existing content or content that you want to teach with these existing story maps. And then the second thing I wanted to mention here is creating your own story maps, which is extremely viable. And we're going to do that here today in this workshop in the next 5 hours. Just kidding, we don't have 5 hours. Just want to make sure you are on your toes. But you can create your own story maps to summarize a hands-on activity that you've got with your students, a research project of your own or from your students, some field work that they were investigating on litter, invasive species, water quality, etc., or as a key component in GIS and GI science courses, which I know some of you are involved with. So story maps being one of the things that you want your students to actually learn about and do as part of the GIS platform. So I'm going to turn you loose here for a moment into the story maps gallery, and let's go ahead and paste this into the chat box. We're not going to spend a ton of time here, but take a short browse through here. If we had more time, we'd spend 10, 20 minutes, but we don't have, alas, we don't have time. But I'm going to come back in a minute or so and touch base with you all. Meanwhile, I'm happy to take questions too.
Joseph, you might touch on this later, but I'm wondering if not, if you could comment on the like format of story maps and like classic versus 2.0.
Yeah, I wasn't going to talk about that right at the beginning, but I've definitely got a whole section there about that.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, since you asked, we can chat about it now. But there is a classics gallery and a way to make, and it's about midway through that presentation that we've been looking at. But so, for example, if you open the classic story maps tab or a link there, and then you've got the one that's the new ArcGIS story maps, you'll see some differences. This classic gallery, and I'm sorry about the duplication, this is a little issue that's being resolved, but this classic gallery came about in about 2010 when Alan Carroll, chief cartographer from National Geographic, came over to Esri, having completed his wonderful career there at National Geographic. And he said, I've got this idea for story maps. And we said, Alan, that's great. Here's a team. You build your team. Here's the technology. Go for it. And for several years, Alan and his team created a story map every week. They would create a story map. And many of these are extremely compelling. That'd be kind of a cool job, right? To make a story map every week. That would have been fun. But the even better thing, though, was when the user community, all you all, and others in transportation, health, and natural resources, and et cetera, said, we want to use those. And we will use those. And so now we've got about 1.75 million story maps out there created by, again, from middle school students all the way to lifelong learners at the university and, of course, in non-educational circles as well. So as the 2010s rolled along, not to bore you with all kinds of stories, but there were several tools that you could use, as you can see here in the apps zone at the top of that classic story maps gallery, where you could say, I want to create a story map tour, or a journal, or a cascade where I've got a kind of a flowing effect, or a short list where I've got these little buttons on the side with the little images. That was great for its time, but as the decade approached its end, Alan and the story maps developer team said, these tools were created at different times and they don't all work together, and you have to decide what to make first, because you can't midway through say, I really didn't want a short list, I wanted a cascade, and I'd have to back out of that and go to cascade. I couldn't switch in the middle. And with the development of computer architecture and technology and the JavaScript API and so on and so forth, other developments led to about 2019-ish the new ArcGIS story maps to be created. So I'm glad you mentioned this, because people ask me probably at least once a week, hey, Joseph, are we going to be able to make the classics? I'm not talking, Peter Frampton and Boston here. Hey, Boston, those classic bands. I'm talking about classic story maps, okay? So yes, you still will be able to make these, but I highly encourage you to at least dip some toes into the ArcGIS story maps waters. And there are several key reasons. I've got at least 500 of my own classic story maps out there that I've created over the years. About 10% of them now have some issue. There's a broken something or other that doesn't work right. 90% of them still work. Okay, so it's kind of like ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro in a sense, where ArcMap will still work, but as you move forward, you really need to be embracing some of the newer tools because they will be supported and maintained. Whereas this, over time, these are going to be functional less and less. I think in a few years' time, they're still going to be working, and people have some great content here. So again, you think about, okay, for a new project, though, I probably should use the new ArcGIS story maps. Nothing against these, because there's some wonderful content that I use and many of you probably use. So that's a little bit about the ArcGIS story maps that started in 2019. It's a seamless, and that's what we're going to use today, a seamless way of making this. So your basic, and it's a lot simpler actually than some of these classic apps were. And as time goes on, we will have more and more functionality built into the ArcGIS story maps. There are still some things that you can do in Classic that haven't migrated over, and I'm keenly aware of that. So I understand, and I've got some of those things myself that I want to do. But as the platform updates just about every quarter, it becomes two things: easier to use and more powerful. So I think that's great news for the user community. Okay. So we've been browsing the story maps gallery. There's a lot of good ones in there, and time, doesn't permit us to do. I'm trying to have you put on your teacher hat in a sense here. So if you were teaching this to your students at this point, I would highly recommend, actually going into a couple of these and asking the students, what did you find most compelling and why? You have some interaction there with the students at that point. Some of my favorites are right here. As you can see, if you scroll down into that story map, the age of the Anthropocene, that's a classic story map. It's a map journal story map, still very good content. I've always liked this one about the Titanic because it does what I love most about maps. It challenges your sort of preconceived notion of how the world works. Because if you thought, for example, that everybody on that ship was from Ireland, England, or the USA, most of them were, yes, but as you can see from even this map right here, many of them were from Scandinavia. There's some from South and Southeast Asia. There's a few from Australia, and of course, since it's tied to a GIS, I often use this to illustrate what is GIS. So if you've got it's grim, but you've got who lived and who died. These are just passengers. It's not the crew, but every point has a database behind it, and it gives you the statistics on that person. So fascinating. And also I go over to Denver here, and hey, it's Molly Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown. So she lived, and so fortunately she's got her statistics there on the story map. But that's another classic one. It's a tabbed story map. There's a couple others. Where are people moving? So I used to work at the Census Bureau, and I know many of you love demographic analysis, and so you might want to take a look at this livability Philadelphia map. I know Boston's great too, but the point is, this is an example of a map that's been embedded into another website. So again, showing the capability that these maps don't just stand alone and you have to tell people, well, go to arcgis.com and search for these story maps. You can actually embed them in your own web pages, which is what this Philadelphia delivers set of. Here's another one that I really like because in part, this is a student-created story map about right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And B, it's a middle school student, okay? So that's pretty cool. So we work with K through 12 education, as I think many of you know. And then what I really like about this, part C, is that the student actually came up with a potential solution for the problem that she identified here. And that is that a lot of times they get trapped in these lobster traps. So here's a way around the problem or through the problem. So, it's not just here's the problem, but here's a potential solution. So I really like this one a lot. And so I keep using it. Here's a new one from a student. This is a high school student, but using UAV data for this story map about that student's campus. So this is a new story map. So you've got this immersive capability with some links and so on and so forth, and the UAV or drone imagery of the actual campus, and actually how the student created this, walking through the whole workflow. So I love this one, and creating a map from the UAV data. So those are a couple of examples. Let's get into a little bit of the framework and the perspective of how to do this, and then we'll get into some hands-on work here.